Hey guys, today we're going to be taking a look at the RTX 5060 in Fortnite. You can see the specs for the card over here in GPU-Z. We're going to be using the MSI Shadow 2X version of the card, which is just a simple 2-fan version of the card. Of course, this card has, unfortunately, those 8 GB of GDDR7. Over on MSI Afterburner, we're running the card at stock and default, no overclock applied, and on the latest NVIDIA drivers. And pairing with a 9800X3D as well as 64 GB of DDR5 just to make sure we give the actual GPU the best chance without any sort of CPU bottleneck. Let's hop in. All right, we're going to start off here at 1080p and using the performance rendering mode. View distance is set to epic, textures are set to high, and this does still get us, native resolution here, so we'll see how this looks. So as we begin falling, we'll go ahead and begin counting our FPS. So this is really just for people, who don't care about visuals. They really just want the most, competitive version of Fortnite you can possibly have. And here on these performance settings, the game does look pretty atrocious, but we are, of course, getting an incredibly high FPS, if not for some pretty terrible 1% lows. Those 1% lows, in my opinion, or from what I can tell, they seem to be more the fault of the engine itself as opposed to really any sort of GPU bottleneck. Aside from just those odd stutters here and there, it is a very, very high FPS here at 500. So, there are certainly very high refresh rate 1080p displays, and you can certainly take advantage of these lower render settings. Now, if we restart counting our FPS, it looks like our 1% lows do dip back up. See if they stay there. And they very quickly go back down into pretty low territory, right around the 70s right here. And while we are getting a very, very high FPS, our GPU the utilization is kind of all over the place. So I do think that we could probably get really close to this FPS without sacrificing so much in terms of visuals. All right, now still on 1080p, but now moving up to DirectX 12 for our graphics API. And we'll be on the low graphics preset here using TAA, and we're going to use 100% 3D resolution. So just low settings with TAA for anti-aliasing and at native resolution. All right, jumping in now at our low settings now on DirectX 12, and we are still getting a high FPS. We're not in like the 500 to 600 range like we were with performance settings, but we're still getting very, very high FPS, and at least so far, our 1% lows are actually considerably better. And really, even on low settings, the game looks like miles and miles better. And honestly, the TAA seems to be doing okay. I'm not really noticing a ton of like blurriness or anything like that. Just so long as you, of course, remember to make sure you're playing at 100% 3D resolution, not using that dynamic resolution scaling, you should still be getting a relatively good picture. And our GPU utilization looks a lot more healthy on these settings too. Hovering right around 95 on our usage is certainly better than, dipping even to the 50s, 80s, things like that. That just shows that our GPU wasn't giving its, its best necessarily. And while we are still getting like the odd tiny spike here and there, honestly, it's a pretty smooth experience with our 1% lows way more respectable up in the 180 FPS territory now. So I would personally probably forego those, performance settings on a 5060. I think that you are better off utilizing, DirectX 12 and using just low settings if you want super high FPS. And now let's bump up from low up to medium. And again, just sticking with TAA until it doesn't look so good and sticking with native 100% resolution. And here on medium settings, we are still getting a really respectable FPS right around 300 or so as I kind of get trapped under this building. So, my first initial thought is just, it doesn't seem to really be a super great reason to play at performance settings or even low settings because we're getting essentially the same performance here at medium. So averaging right around 320 or so in this particular area. Now, just because I'm not super well versed in benchmarking Fortnite, I changed these settings mid-match. So I'm going to go ahead and jump out and reload the game just to ensure that these are actually accurate settings right around the 320 mark, 315 mark, somewhere in that range, just to ensure that, we are actually where we think we are. And it does look like even after reloading, we are still getting right around that 315 to 320. Of course, around like water or things like that, that will pretty drastically change performance. But yeah, definitely really strong performance here. 1080p medium at native resolution. And we're using TAA, which honestly, a lot of times I don't love TAA as an anti-aliasing solution, but seems to actually be offering us a pretty good looking image here. There's not really like a ton of like super fine details, of course, here at medium settings, and even, it's Fortnite. So even as we begin bumping up settings, the fine details, like super fine details, are really not going to be that noticeable with any sort of like weird jagginess or anything like that, or like kind of that ugly smearing effect that you sometimes get with TAA. So yeah, definitely really strong performance here. Of course, 1080p, this is also still pretty low settings, but overall, pretty happy here. So let's go ahead and bump up one more to high, and we'll stick with TAA native. And now here on high settings, we are getting a pretty noticeable FPS decrease, coming from 300 down to 200. So actually a pretty substantial decrease, but, so we kind of get away from the water. We're getting a bit higher now into the 250s, but still, pretty solid performance. Can't really complain too much. I would, me personally, someone who's not super competitive in Fortnite, I would still consider this to be, adequate FPS for, performing however I would regardless of FPS. So definitely pretty solid settings here. And on high settings, the game definitely it's starting to definitely look better with all this grass and things like that. And now our GP utilization is in a much better spot now, hovering right around 98, 97. So certainly better than it was even, at medium or low settings, just, showing the fact that we are actually starting to really use that GPU power that we have. You have the GPU, so you definitely want to use it. The higher the better as far as the GPU utilization goes. And honestly, if you're playing at 1080p, this may be where you want to be at, depending on the refresh rate of your monitor. 200 FPS is a really good place to be at. Let's see if we can actually find someone to shoot at. Here's someone. And I don't know if everyone who plays Fortnite is just terrible, or maybe I'm getting matched with bots, but everyone who I've come across is actually, absolutely terrible at this game. And that's coming from someone who's equally terrible. So, and again, high settings here, even still getting, pretty solid as far as our 1% lows go. Definitely way better than even at performance. So while we were getting very high FPS with performance, the 1% lows kind of kill the experience. Now let's bump up to our Epic preset here, sticking with native. And Epic settings does give us another pretty substantial dip in our performance. We're well above 60 still, in fact, averaging 120 right now. It looks like I got an enemy running up on me here. I do not know where that enemy went, actually. But as you can see, we're still getting high FPS, in my opinion. I mean, 130 FPS average is definitely more than enough for me personally. I would probably prefer, slightly lower settings and, getting a much higher refresh rate. But this is definitely, not a terrible way to play. Now, the next setting here is going to be turning on our ray tracing, which we will have to actually exit the match to do. So we're out of the game now, and we're going to go for completely maxed out settings. So we're using TAA still, 100% resolution scale. Our dynamic resolution is off, and we're using Nanite, Lumen Epic for both our global illumination, as well as our reflections, and hardware ray tracing. And now dropped in with those max settings, the game looks actually pretty great here. But of course, we are getting, still above 60 FPS, but certainly not really what I would consider to be a competitive type experience. So while, it's not terrible FPS, as you can see, as we kind of move around, we are getting below 60 in certain situations. Our average is still above 60 FPS, but, competitive game like Fortnite and, competitive games in general, I would probably advise against using ray tracing. I just don't really think it's worth the FPS hit. You don't want to give yourself a competitive disadvantage just to have some pretty reflections and shadows and things like that. But if your bar was just, getting a 60 FPS average, you certainly can do that without even utilizing any sort of upscaling. But of course, we have DLSS, so we may as well use it. So let's just put it on DLSS quality. And DLSS quality looks essentially native here. Unfortunately, the overlay is blocked. It looks like you can see we're scaling up from 720p. I'm actually not seeing what preset we're on, unfortunately. But it looks pretty solid here, honestly. It doesn't look that far off of TAA. In fact, it may even look slightly better than TAA, and we are getting, a 25 or so FPS boost. And depending on the scene, you may even get a bit more. So definitely nice to see that, you can crank all the settings and get a near native experience while still getting consistently above 60 FPS, so long as you are okay with just utilizing just a little bit of that upscaling. Let's turn on a bit more upscaling here, now going down to balance, which is now coming from 627p. And now we're getting pretty close to that high refresh rate, like 120 FPS at times. Maybe not, actually, closer to 90. Again, you know, a game like this, it is very dependent on what particular scene that you are around. So, of course, you know, scaling from a lower resolution, you will get, you know, higher FPS. But as you can see, our video memory is creeping up. In fact, I wasn't really looking at it at native, but the fact that we are already at, you know, nearing 8 gigabytes makes me wonder what we were at native. So let's just double check that. Let's go back to TAA and slide our resolution all the way to 100. And yeah, that's kind of what I was talking about. You know, just different scenes in this game certainly behave much differently. So at TAA here, it looks like we are still probably under that 8 gigabytes. We're close enough that this, you know, the video memory could potentially be our limiting factor here, which is definitely where that upscaling comes in at times, you know, and kind of saves the day. Let's go ahead and drive around a little bit, see if maybe loading in some new areas, we can get our video memory to go up even more. And it does seem like it's pretty happy right around where we're at, about 7,700 megabytes. Or just about 7.5 gigabytes. Definitely not terrible, you know, performance here, considering we are at max settings at native resolution. And now let's test our final DLSS setting, now at performance DLSS, which is now coming from 540p. And now we are getting a super high FPS, pretty solidly above 100. And let's see if we can actually kill someone. This seems to be a real person. Okay, we were able to kill him. Now we have a TIE fighter flying around us with an X-Wing behind it. It's so funny. It's just really crazy as someone who really played a lot of Fortnite when it was kind of actually popular, or, you know, when it first came out in like 2017, 2018, seeing everything that's been added to the game is pretty crazy. And, you know, I'm not 100% sure what version of DLSS or what preset. I'm assuming we're on a CNN model. But honestly, even at performance, the image quality still looks really solid. And again, you know, we're not making any sort of sacrifices. We're playing at complete max settings and getting this kind of performance. So definitely pretty happy with the 5060. As far as 1080p goes, you know, you really don't need to introduce much in terms of upscaling, you know, to get a playable FPS. Here we introduced all the way down to performance, and we're still getting a good looking image. And I guess, you know, it's probably depending on the person and how competitive they actually want to be, whether or not you might consider this like a competitive, acceptable type performance. Now, this is definitely a real person with how this person's building. And yeah, that's what happens when I face a real person. Now jumping up to 1440p, and we're going to start on our performance mode. View and textures set both to epic. And diving in here with our performance mode, of course, you know, the game looks pretty terrible with performance, but we are getting really high FPS. Go ahead and begin counting here, and I'll be interested to see if we're still getting that pretty abysmal 1% lows. I will say, at least to begin with here, we are getting considerably better performance when it just comes to our actual GPU utilization. It does seem that our GPU is actually being properly utilized for the most part. Maybe I spoke too soon, as I see it dip into the 70s there. And our 1% lows are pretty bad once again, down into the 40s. So, you know, while you are able to get a really high FPS, I kind of think the 1% lows pretty much ruin it. I mean, yeah, you know, you can come in here at 1440p performance and get 400 FPS average, but is it worth it when your 1% lows are all the way down to the 80s? You know, probably not for most people. And as we continue on, you can see our 1% low is dipping back up a little bit, but 100, you know, FPS on a 1% low when we're averaging close to 500 still is not a super great experience, but definitely performing better than it was at 1080p, as, you know, both the 1% lows and our GPU utilization is considerably better, as we just hit a major stutter there. So I'd probably stay away from the setting on 1080p, but I could see the argument for, you know, 1440p if you wanted to just dump everything down, play it competitive here. You're not getting as bad of a experience here. All right, and now we are on DirectX 12, 1440p, playing on the low preset TAA at 100% resolution scale. And now dropping in at those low settings, you can see we are getting, you know, still very high FPS. Not as high, of course, as the performance settings, but my opinion, you know, depending on your monitor's refresh rate, I don't think most people have like 500 hertz 1440p monitors. I don't even know if those really exist. But 200 FPS as we're getting here. We'll begin counting here in a second, but I do think that this FPS is definitely, suitable for most people. I think it'd be pretty unusual that, 300 FPS like we're getting here is not enough for what you're kind of targeting. And as you can see, we also do get the other benefit of our 1% lows being considerably higher at 170. So honestly, I'd probably avoid that performance setting, with DirectX 11. I think that's probably, I'd imagine that's more for people with like extremely low-end hardware. And here at low settings, we're able to play at 1440p. We're able to get a native, real clean looking image, and nothing is really being taxed too bad. Our GPU is being utilized, but it's not, out of control where, we're super hamstrung for performance or anything like that. And our video memory also is well under control, just sitting right around 4 gigabytes. So let's go ahead and we'll just bump up to the medium settings now. And here at medium settings, we're sitting right around 200. So still, what I'd consider to be a high refresh rate experience. Let's see if we can get into a bit of combat here and, still able to perform, do everything we need to do here. I'd consider this to probably be a competitive performance in my personal opinion. I did die there, but I don't think a higher FPS would have saved me. And now bumping up to the high preset, still sticking with native here. And loaded into a new match here, you can see here at high settings, we're still getting, relatively high performance, good performance, high FPS, but we are now kind of slowly getting out of what I would consider to be like a super competitive experience. Someone like me, this is probably enough FPS, but I know there are certainly people who need or think they need or want a much higher FPS, so I would certainly understand, 150, 120, kind of in that range, not quite being enough, but we'll play for a little bit here, see how it feels. Of course, we are also in this kind of indoor area here, which will probably result in better performance than some other areas, but as you can see, even someone as terrible as me is able to get a few kills here. Let's go ahead and begin driving around, maybe a slightly more intensive experience here. Still, as far as our video memory goes, still sitting well under our 8 gigabyte kind of allowance here. Let's go ahead and see if we can hop on this train. I don't really know if performance on this train is supposed to be better or worse than normal, but definitely able to still hold well above that 120 FPS average, looks like. But hey, what if you just wanted a bit more, just wanted to throw on maybe DLSS quality here? And with DLSS quality, it looks essentially native, still looks super clean. And now we're getting, when we were getting around 120, now we're getting right around 160 or so. So, my opinion, if you're playing on this GPU, there's not really a great reason to not use DLSS in a game like this when you have it. And now, at quality, we're upscaling from 961p, so still a pretty high FPS as is. Typically the higher your resolution is, so 1440p. Quality looks better at 1440p than quality does at 1080p because you're already using a somewhat acceptable resolution to begin with. So honestly, at 1440p, much like 1080p, I'd probably stick right around high settings. The game looks good, you're still getting a really good looking experience, but you're not really going up to ray tracing and introducing all those effects to where you're really seriously sacrificing that performance just for that kind of visual treat. I'm also being shot at, but I don't know from where. And last preset here is Epic. So we'll keep it on DLSS quality here for Epic. And now we are getting still above, 100 or so FPS. So still a pretty solid experience. And honestly, the performance doesn't really look miles different. I guess it is maybe about 20 FPS lower here at Epic. Now, again, we have not yet enabled that nanite, all those ray tracing features. So that will certainly tank the FPS much, much more. But you are able to get a real solid, looking picture and performance here. And I wish I knew what exact preset we're using for DLSS, but I'm not actually 100% sure. So here at Epic settings, without ray tracing, DLSS quality, we're getting right around 130 on our average. And last setting here we'll test is Epic, everything maxed out. And this one, I do want to see what native will give us. So we're going to go with TAA to begin with, and nanite on with Epic, Lumen Epic, global illumination reflections, and hardware ray tracing. And here at completely maxed out settings, 1440p, this is now our first test that we are pretty solidly below that 60 FPS mark. You can see our video memory is creeping up. Again, as it kind of gets around this territory, right around like 76, 7700, seems like it could potentially be a VRAM bottleneck that's causing this issue, though, it's hard to tell, especially in Unreal Engine 5 games, because Unreal Engine 5 just happens to kind of stutter on its own, and that is one of the signs of that VRAM bottleneck, so maybe a bit of both. Go ahead and begin counting here just to kind of see what we can get. Now, the game does look absolutely great, I will say. However, going into the 30s, not really what I would consider to be a playable experience. While we can move around, you can certainly come in here, take screenshots, enjoy the game just from a visual standpoint. The actual experience and smoothness, as you can see, our frame time graph is spiking up and down constantly, is a pretty unpleasant experience. So we'll definitely have to use some upscaling to make this setting, even remotely playable. So let's switch over to DLSS and go for the balance preset, which uses 57% resolution scale. And this is now rendering from 836p. And this does now give us a 60 plus FPS experience. So definitely, much nicer here. And while it's still not, a competitive like experience, it is good enough to where you can certainly play the game like this, have a decent experience. And actually, it looks like we are still at times dipping below that 60 FPS. So we may even need to go in and adjust it even more. So let's bring it on down to performance. Performance is now using 720p as our base resolution, and we'll see how this kind of looks as we begin running around. Already going into, let's see, now into the 90s. Wow, that's a pretty wild swing. Back down to the 50s. So our frame time graph is kind of all over the place. It seems as though maybe the ray tracing, depending on where we're actually looking, it may be more demanding in those areas. So yeah, still not a 60 FPS experience. While our average is 60 FPS, when we are getting 60 FPS some of the time, I will say it's below 60 FPS enough of the time, like now, here and there, that I would consider this to be not super great. So let's use TSR, which is Temporal Super Resolution, Epic's own solution here, at the recommended setting, which is 60% resolution scale. And even this doesn't give us great performance. In fact, this gives us far worse performance here now into the 30s. So even the TSR, at least at Epic here, doesn't seem to really be helping out much more than DLSS. In fact, DLSS was giving us a much better experience. So let's try just TSR low set to performance. And TSR low set to performance does give us, the image looks, I will say the image looks pretty terrible when compared to DLSS, and we are getting right around the same performance as we were with DLSS set to performance. So probably stick to DLSS rather than TSR, at least on the 50 series, like a 5060, I'd rather use the DLSS. Definitely gives you a sharper looking image. So it looks like really the most you're going to get is kind of hovering right around 60 FPS at complete max settings at 1440p. While I would like to see a better performance, I don't think a ton of people are buying, the cheapest 50 series card and expecting to get completely maxed out ray trace settings, at high refresh rates. But the fact that you're able to get 60 FPS, I guess it's okay. I would like to get more, but at the end of the day, you get what you pay for, and I wouldn't really recommend that most people go for all these fancy ray trace settings in multiplayer game anyways. And just to show it, this is 4K using DirectX 12 native resolution and on the low preset. So on the low preset, here you are able to play at 4K native resolution and actually get a pretty solid performance, honestly. And, while this isn't really how I would choose or want to play, it is kind of cool to see that you can even get a 4K experience without utilizing any sort of upscaling. And really, I'd highly recommend using upscaling anyways, but here at low settings, you are able to get a relatively decent experience. If you just wanted to say, hey, I can run Fortnite at 4K, yeah, that's true. You can do that. And, our 1% lows are pretty respectable, right around 58, pretty close to that 60 FPS. So it actually feels like a pretty solid experience. We are still getting those stutters that we were getting pretty much at every single setting that we've tested. I don't think that guy landed a single shot on us. But really, if you're playing at 4K, you want to be using some sort of upscaling. So let's go ahead and put on DLSS Performance, which puts us at 50% resolution scale or 1080p. And now here on low settings, we are able to get, around 130 FPS with those 1% lows brought, but, up a bit more into the 80s. And while you are still getting, the same stutters as you get always in these types of games, it does seem to be slightly better than at some of our other settings. Game definitely doesn't look amazing at low settings, so let's see what the same settings DLSS performance looks like at medium. And at the medium preset, we're still getting, well above 60 FPS with our 1% low is still above 60 FPS. We do get a bit of a dip, but the game does look actually like pretty considerably better, I will say. I've really found Fortnite probably to be the best looking as far as like performance to visuals, probably around high, but definitely medium doesn't look too bad at all, especially when you're looking at such a high resolution picture. And really the upscaling doesn't look too bad on a 4K image. I think it actually looks really good, to be honest. So, final thoughts on the Fortnite experience here on the 5060. It's definitely playable and you're going to have a good experience. Now, Fortnite's not the most competitive or hardest game to get, good experience in, when you're looking at any GPU. Pretty much any old GPU from previous generations can give you a really solid experience. But, just considering the fact that, the 5060 might be, there's a good chance that, it will be the most popular GPU on the market. And Fortnite is one of the most popular PC games. The fact that you are able to get a pretty solid experience at a range of different settings on the entry level to the, the 50 series of cards, I'd say is a pretty good, it's a pretty good sign. Anyways, that's been it. I appreciate it. Thank you guys so much for watching. This is my first time benchmarking Fortnite in any sort of like real in-depth fashion. So if I got anything wrong, feel free to point me out, any corrections in the comments below. I'd actually be happy to hear them. But I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.